My dear friends, it's an auspicious welcome to all of you here in this presentation. Once again, I am Dr. Atul Suryawanshi before you, College, Patora, District Jalgaon of Maharashtra State. A week before, we studied novels. Then after a week, we are here once again to discuss short stories. So without wasting the time, let us initiate this presentation. I request you to be ready with your pen and pencil or the notebook to take the notes. For this video lecture will be with you forever. So let's begin with a short story today. So very foremost question arises in your mind that what is short story? What is the meaning of this? Your short story is a work of fiction. It is an imaginary story that can be read in one setting, usually written in prose, often in a narrative form, having limited characters and generally having a moral behind it. So we have to see these points. That short story is always written in the prose. It is in the narrative form. It has limited characters. And generally, there is a moral behind the short story. As we know quite well that Yusuf's fables are quite popular in the world. The most of the stories written in Marathi are entitled as Isapaniti, having a moral behind those stories. So the stories of Akbar and Birbal are also moral-based stories. So this is very beautiful, fantastic world, especially meant for children. And the novels and the short story is a special genre for the study of NET and SET examination. Select questions are there for the students. So now this becomes utmost important to study this genre for the study, for the sake of enjoyment, and to know literature better, to have moral values from the short stories. Short story is generally has less than 2000 words approximately. So this is tentative, this is approximate length of the short story. It can be a little bigger or lesser than it. For example, The Little Match Girl is a beautiful story written by Hans Andersen, is the best example of this. But this is once again a sample example. There are a number of short stories which are quite popular in English literature. Before we going to study those stories in brief, let's have a fleeting glance on the select elements of the short story. We have to see the theory first, and then we will turn gradually towards studying a beautiful synopsis of the select short stories which are very much popular in English literature and meant very useful for NET and SET examination point of view. So dear friends, let us initiate. The elements of the short story. It comprises the first, character, second, setting, then plot, then conflict, then theme, then point of view, then tone, and the final is style. So these are the select elements of the short story. They it may be more than that, but these are the prominent, for the sake of study. Character, setting, plot, conflict, theme, point of view, tone, and style. We have studied this when we studied novels. The element of the novel and element of the short story, approximately they are same. So let us turn toward the next slide here on this series. The first element of the short story, character. So we studied character before this when we studied novel. Characters are the people, animals, or personified inanimate objects who experiences the story. So there may be people living around us, or the animals, or personified inanimate object. Writers use characters to perform their action and speak dialogue. So most of the dialogue is spoken by the characters, are written by the writers. The characters are the mouthpiece of the writers, moving the story along a plot line. So the story proceeds further in the direction of climax, culmination, to get a moral out of it. Then again, they are broadly categorizing. There are two types of characters. One is protagonist. Protagonist means the central character in the story. And the next is antagonist. Anti, opposite meaning. Okay. So this antagonist is generally a villain in the story, is a bad person in the story. Again, broadly categorizing, we studied when we studied novel, flat characters and round characters. So flat characters are those characters who do not change their nature, their temperament in the course of the story. They are rigid characters and they remain static. They do not change their nature till the end of the story. Those are flat characters. Round characters are those characters who change their nature, their temperament up to the end of the story. They are dynamic characters. They are flexible. They change their nature. Right? They understand the situation and mold themselves accordingly. Those characters are round characters, remember. So these are the broad categories, flat characters and round characters, protagonists and antagonists for the sake of understanding. Character is an important element of the short story. Let us turn towards the next slide, setting. The setting of a story refers to the time and location in which the story takes place. So it is about time and location in the story. That means setting. Setting can be a real time period and geographical location, or a fictional world and unfamiliar time period. So there are many types of setting. For example, single setting, double setting, or multiple settings. So these are the broad categories. But in general, we should try to understand this reality that setting is the reference of time and location given in the story. I hope that your concept is very clear now regarding setting. So let us turn towards the next element in the short story, and that is plot. It is the section of the story. So the plot of the story is the sequence of events that shape a broader narrative, with every event affecting each other. Okay, so a strong plot is centered on one moment, an interruption of a pattern, a turning point, or an action that raises a dramatic question which must be answered through the course of the story. So this is plot. So let's understand the meaning of this. I read it again for the sake of your understanding. The plot of a story is the sequence of events that shape broader narrative, with every event affecting each other. So plot is nothing but the arrangement and the sequence of so many events woven together. It comprises plot. A strong plot is a center to only one moment, an interruption of a pattern, a turning point, or an action that raises a dramatic question which must be answered through the course of the story. So a question is posed. As I told you, some sort of conflict is there in the mind, and attempt has been made to search the answer of that particular question in the story. And at the end of the story, we get the answer. So this is the development of this plot in the direction of the climax of the story. The plot develops towards culmination of the story. Let us turn towards the next element of the short story, which is conflict. It is very beautifully said that without conflict, short story, novel, drama, and this life doesn't exist. Conflict in a story is a struggle between opposing forces. Characters must act to confront those forces where conflict is born. If there is nothing to overcome, there is no story. So conflict drives the plot forward. Conflict is the backbone, is the soul of the story, which drives the story plot, and the development of the story proceeds further, goes further in the direction of culmination towards climax. Conflict creates crucial tension in the story. So this is the essential thing, tension. When tension arises in the story, some sort of comic relief is also there in the story for the sake of amusements. Conflict with the self, conflict with the others, conflict with the environment, that means conflict with nature, conflict with supernatural forces, conflict with others, conflict with animals, conflict with the ghosts. So many types of conflicts may be there. A select conflict have been mentioned here in this slide for the sake of understanding. So we have to remember this one thing here, that conflict is an essential element of the short story, an inseparable part of the short story, which is the backbone and the soul of the short story. Many types of conflicts are there, external or internal, mind conflict or the external forces. Conflict is very much essential. So let us turn towards the next slide in this here in the series, the element of the short story, theme. So theme is the underlying meaning of a story. It is the message that the writer is trying to convey through the story. Often the theme of a story is a broad message about life. So this is actual content that makes to run the story. Common theme in the stories includes good versus evil forces. The theme of love may be there in the story. As we are going to study one story here entitled Orpheus and Eurydice. The theme of environment is there, protection of the nature, protecting the trees and the environment is also there. Some common themes are concerning courage, war, struggle in the life, and the ultimate truth of human life, death. So these are the most common themes in the short stories. So again, theme is very much important here as an essential element of the short story. Let's proceed further towards the next slide, which will inform us about the point of view in the story. So what is point of view? Point of view is the writer's way of deciding who is telling the story and to whom. So this is the way to tell the story. Point of view is the eye or the narrative voice through which a story is told. Broadly categorizing this point of view, there are three point of view. The first person, which always initiates with I, me, we, us, like this. In first person narration. Most of the stories are written in first person narration. Again, there is second person narration. The narrator describes the reader's action and thoughts using the word you. So whenever we read this word you, this is second person narration. And again, there is third person narration. The third person pronouns such as he, she, it, they, him, her, his, them. This is the use of the third person narration in the story. So these are the various points of view used in the story. Like the novels, there are flashback and foreshadowing technique also in the story. But this is the minor element. Point of view is very important. Most of the stories are written in first person narration. Let's proceed further without wasting the time toward the next element in the short story, which is tone. So what is tone? It refers to the author's attitude towards a certain topic. So the intention and the attitude, the thinking of the writer is known as the tone in the short story. Through specific word choice, the author reveals feelings and opinions to the reader, conveying the author's intention, writing behind the text, writing behind the story. The tone in a story generally indicates a particular feeling. It can be the feeling of joyfulness. It can be serious. Sometimes it becomes humorous. Melancholy, that means sad. The story turned towards and happiness and sadness, intermingle and interwoven in most of the stories very beautifully by the writers who are going to study the select stories after studying the element of the story. Threatening, formal, informal, optimistic, pessimistic, sincere, hypocritical, fearful, hopeful, humorous, and serious are some of the select tones used in the story. So the tone add flavor in the story, makes the story very interesting for the sake of understanding and for the sake of enjoyment, especially to the children. So let's proceed further. The next element in the short story is style. So what is style? The style describes the way that the author uses the words. The author's word choice, sentence structure, and the use of the figurative language and the sentence arrangement all work together to establish the mood, images, and meaning in the text. So major types of the writing styles are persuasive, who makes someone to persuade something, who change the attitude and the thinking style of someone are persuasive stories. Some stories are narrative, which narrate the incident. Expository, that means illustrative stories, full of various descriptions. Again, descriptive stories are there. Reflective stories, which makes someone to ponder and to think very seriously about life. Such reflective stories are also there. Some personal stories are also there. Personal and autobiographical flavor is also there while writing the stories. So these are the selected styles of writing the stories. My dear friends, I hope that your concept of element of the short story is quite clear now, and there should be no doubt in your mind regarding this. So, after offering a fleeting glance to the select elements of the short stories in English, let's have a fleeting glance again on the select short stories which are quite popular in English literature. An attempt is made here in this presentation, in these slides, to offer a fleeting glance on those stories, especially which are very much important for the sake of NEET and SET examinations in English. So, the first famous story ever written in 1948 by Shirley Jackson, entitled The Lottery. So, what is the story about? Let's study. In brief, The Lottery, which published in 1948, is a short story written by Shirley Jackson. The story describes a fictional small American community which observes an annual tradition known as the lottery, in which the member of the community is selected by chance and stoned to death to ensure a good harvest and purge the town of bad omens. So many customs are there, and this story, The Lottery, written by Shirley Jackson, focuses on the reality that most of the communities all over the world, they follow some traditions and customs. And the story is the best example of that. So I will not tell you in detail about the characters and the theme and the moral of the story. Now it is your responsibility, my dear friends, to visit the net and to search the details of the story. Because this is time-bound activity, the time is fleeting, we have limited time here. So I request you with the folding hands to search all the details related to all the stories meant here in this presentation. For your kind perusal only. Search all the details and study the stories in detail on YouTube. Search them on internet. The second story here in this series is The Happy Prince, the most popular story among children, written by Oscar Wilde, published in 1888. So what is the story about in general? The Happy Prince is the story of a majestic statue that looks down over a city. The prince had an easy, luxurious life. Now he is tied to that immobile statue, bathed in gold and with precious stones, jades. However, he is not happy with that. Why? Because here on the topmost position, he observes the misery and the poverty in the town, which he was previously unaware of. When he was alive, he didn't understand the reality that is poverty, hunger, unhappiness in the world. And now the same thing becomes his pain. He becomes sad. And for the relief of that happy prince, a swallow who was left behind after his flew off to Egypt for the winter meets the statue of the late happy prince. He helps the poor people, needy people, which makes happy prince full of contentment and satisfied. But in doing so, the happy prince loses all his wealth and gold and become somewhat ugly. Finally, the happy prince, the statue was broken into pieces. The swallow bird also died at the end of the story, leaving the readers in distress and to think very seriously about the problem of poverty and hunger in the world. As I told you, that the moral of the story is very important. We have to check the moral of the story at the end of the story, and this is the message, the moral, the motive, writing behind the stories is very important. Now, as the NetSet aspirants, it is our moral duty to understand it, to understand the intention of the writer, short story writer, behind writing such beautiful stories. Let us turn toward the next story here in this series, entitled The Gift of the Magi, written by Arthur Henry, which published in 1905. So, what is it? The story is about Della, a very beautiful girl, and her husband, James, that means Jim Dillingham Young, which is his full name. So Della is having only $1.87 with her as a saving to buy a Christmas present for her husband, Jim. Della loses her long hairs to buy the platinum chain for Jim's ancestral watch. On the other hand, what happens, Jim sells his watch to buy an expensive set of combs made of the tortoise shells. The Christmas presents becomes meaningless for each other. And so the very title given to this story, The Gift of the Magi, seems to be ironical. Because Magi are the people who brought present for baby Jesus for the very first time when Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Israel. So Magi are intelligent people. Magi are clever people. But this is the present that they chose for each other was not intelligent and sensible. But still, it shows the love of the husband and wife for each other, which is the moral of the story. That there should be the feeling of love in the heart to make the relationship more stronger. Let's turn toward the next story here in this series, The Yellow Wallpaper, written by Charlotte Gilman, published in 1892. The narrator is a young woman who develops an illness which her husband John terms as temporary nervous depression after the birth of her child. She is confined to bed and discouraged from writing previously her creative outlet after John prescribes a rest cure. Her obsession with the yellow wallpaper in her bedroom turns her into a psychotic patient. John faints after seeing her plight in the room, and the story ends. The wallpaper symbolizes the dull and monotonous life. So the story is seems to be absurd, written by Charlotte Gilman, which focuses on the multifaceted problems in the human life. The word yellow stands for dullness, monotonous life that the human beings are leading today. Let us turn towards the next story, The Monkey's Paw, written by W. W. Jacobs, published in 1902. So I'm reading the brief synopsis of the story for your kind perusal, for your kind reference. Mr. and Mrs. White and their grandson Herbert are visited by Sergeant Major Morris, a friend who served with the British Army in India. During dinner, he introduces them to a mummified monkey's paw. An old fakir placed a spell on the paw so that it would grant 3 wishes. Morris, having a horrible experience using the paw, throws it into the fire, but the skeptical Mr. White retrieves it, takes it back. Before leaving, Morris warns Mr. White about the paw. At Herbert's suggestion, Mr. White flippantly wishes for £200, which will enable him to make the final mortgage payment for his house. The following day, Herbert leaves for work. The night an employee arrives at the White's home, telling them that Herbert had been killed in a terrible machine accident that mutilated his body. The company denies any responsibility for the accident, but declares its intention to make a goodwill payment of £200, which was the wish of Mr. White. A week after the funeral, Mrs. White, mad with the grief, insists that her husband use the pot to wish Herbert back to life. Reluctantly, he does so, despite great unease at the thought of summoning his son's mutilated and decomposing body. Later that night, there is a knock at the door. As Mrs. White fumbles at the locks in a desperate attempt to open the door, Mr. White becomes terrified and fears that the things outside is not the son he loved. He makes his third and the final wish. The knocking stops, and Mrs. White opens the door to find that there is no one. So the monkey's paw belongs to the Gothic genre. The story is full of horror, mystery, and suspense, leaving behind the message that we should believe in hard work and not such supernatural elements in the lives. We should not be superstitious, is the beautiful message of the story. Let us turn toward the next story in the series, written by Franz Kafka in the year 1915, entitled The Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis, that means transformation, change. So the story tells of a salesman, Gregor Samsa, who wakes one morning to find himself inexplicably transformed into a used insect and subsequently struggles to adjust to his new condition. His family members are panicked, and at the end of the story, Gregor Samsa dies, leaving the family relieved forever. So this is somewhat, a work written like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Metamorphosis. So this was the beginning of such an exceptional writing in the short stories. Without wasting the time, let us turn toward the next story, The Little Match Girl, written by Hans Andersen, which published in 1845. So it is a story of a little girl who is unable to sell her matchsticks, dies of the cold and hunger on the street, even as people are celebrating Christmas inside their warm houses. So this story reflects about the unhappy childhood of a little girl, her sadness, dealing with the theme of hunger and poverty. When the little match girl strikes the last match and her granny appears before the little match girl, that girl shouts towards the granny, "Oh, granny! Oh, my dear granny! I do not want to live here on this earth, oh granny, please take me with you. The people who live here on this earth, they are so cruel. They don't offer me anything to eat, oh granny, please take me with you to the heaven." And that granny took that little child into her arms and flew in the direction of the heaven, my dear friends, where neither cold nor hunger can reach. So the story offers very serious message that poverty, hunger are the prime problems here in this world. This is very heart-touching story. Let us turn towards the next story here on the series entitled A Cup of Tea, written by Catherine Mansfield in the year 1922. The protagonist, Rosemary Fell, is a very wealthy woman who was deeply impressed by books. She reads the books by Father Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy and deeply impressed by their humanitarian writing. She calls a beggar girl, Miss Smith, at home for a cup of tea to show humanity for the poor people. When she brings that girl at home at the evening, when her husband tells her that Miss Smith is exceptionally beautiful, you know what happens? Which is the moral of this story: jealousy trumps over generosity. Rosemary Fell expels Miss Smith from her home, come back to her husband who was sitting inside the library and ask him, don't you think that I am also pretty like her? Don't you think that am I beautiful like this? So jealousy trumps over generosity is the moral of the story, A Cup of Tea, written by Catherine Mansfield, which focuses on the reality of human depravity, especially on women's psyche. The next story in the series is Cinderella, or The Little Glass Slipper, written by Charles Perrault in 1697. So let's see the synopsis of the story in brief. An abusive stepmother and two stepdaughters are invited to a royal ball, leaving behind a daughter and sister whom they call Cinderella. A fairy godmother appears and grants Cinderella's wish to go to the ball, magically providing a coach, servant, a dress, and perfectly fitted glass slippers to her. At the end of the story, eventually, the prince marries her. She does not seek revenge on stepmother and stepsister. So this is the moral of the story. To err is human, and to forgive is the divine quality. Next story here in the series is The Mark of Vishnu, written by Khushwant Singh, published in 1950. So the story weaves around the superstitious and blind reverence towards the snake. The servant Gunga Ram, who is the protagonist, the central character of the story, though a Brahmin, was illiterate and full of superstitions. He believes in the Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu and Mahesh, Lord Shiva, as the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer of this universe. He is the devotee of Vishnu. And you know what happens? The children, they take away the snake to the school. He goes there having a bowl of milk with him for the snake, and the snakes bite him, leaving the V mark on his forehead. So the story gives us very serious message that one should not be superstitious. The story ironically presents that the people are still superstitious in their attitude, in their thinking. The next story here in the series is Two Red Roosters, written by Manohar Malgaonkar, whose distant drum is quite famous in English literature. The present story focuses on the superstitious nature of village people. Sonba, the protagonist, the central character of the story, having no bull for ploughing in the field, requests the village churel to help him plowing his farm. So the supernatural elements have been used here in the story. The Kheti Sahib, who is the representative of this modern technology, visits the village to show demonstration of tractor plowing the farm. He selects the farm of Sonba. His farm has been plowed without any efforts. So you can understand what will happen the next day. The two red roosters found dead at the deity under the tree, and the very next morning, Sonba was under the impression that Churel, the village deity, fulfilled his desire by plying his field. This is the age of science and technology, we should not be superstitious. We should believe in scientific things, is the beautiful message of the story. Let us turn towards the next story here in the series, An Astrologer's Day, written by Arkan Orion in 1947. So this is a superstitious story again about a man who runs away from his home and pretends to be an astrologer after imagining that he has committed a murder. In a strange situation, he meets Guru Nayak, the same man he thought he had killed few years ago. He makes him fool, answering him in the correct way because he knows his past, and takes money for him. And at the end of the story, ask his wife to prepare something for eating and rest on the charpai, and the story ends. An Astrologer's Day focuses once again on the blind belief, the superstitious attitude, especially among Indians. The next story here in this series is Cobb and the Anthem, written by Arthur Henry, which published in 1904. So the story is about a homeless man called Sophie. Sophie, he is a very young man, having 23 years of age only, who notices once in a cold night on his park bench that he has to try to do everything that is possible in order to get into prison for the 3 months to survive the winter. He was living a very meaningless and trivial life. He does all the efforts, but the policeman doesn't catch him. He was sitting on the park bench at the end of the story, thinking to live an honest life. And he was thinking about the leading of the honest life. The policeman catches him and sends him to the jail. So, the story offers very serious message to the readers. That when we do something bad in the life, no one is there to stop us. But when we intend something miraculous in the life, at that same time, when we want to do something great in the life, when we want to perform the hard work in the life, to earn bread and butter honestly in the life, there are a number of problems and obstacles in the way. So the story offers very serious message that we should live the honest and truthful life. Next story here in this series is Kabuliwala, published in 1892, written by Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali writer, who is the recipient of the Nobel Prize in 1913 for his massive contribution in literature in Gitanjali. So Kabuliwala, or the man from Kabul, is the story of Abdul Rahman, the seller of the seasonal goods from Kabul. The first sailor, a Pashtun from Kabul, Afghanistan, he visits Kolkata, India each year to sell dry fruits. He is doing this to earn his daily bread and butter. Abdul Rahman's longing for his family, especially his daughter, is central to the story. He is poor, hence away from his loved ones to earn his daily bread and butter. So the story focuses on the human sentiments. The theme of this story is the love of a father and a daughter. So this story, Kabuliwala, is quite popular in literature. Let us turn towards the next story here in this series, entitled The Bet, written by the Russian writer Anton Chekhov, was published in 1889. So bet it about a banker and a young man who make a bet of $2 million versus leading a life of imprisonment for 15 years. with each other based on the capital punishment and whether the death penalty is better or worse than life in the prison. So this is quite absurd. An ironic twist responds to this exploration of the value of a human life with an unexpected result. The message is to live anyhow is better than not to live at all. The message of this story is books are our best friends. As it is well said in English literature, but wherever this casual eyes cast the mighty minds of all my never failing friends, they with whom I converse day by day, seems to be subtle and appropriate regarding this story written by Anton Chekhov entitled The Bait in 1889. So this is one of the classic stories in English literature. We should know this. Let us turn towards the next story here in this series. My Lost Dollar, written by Stephen Leacock. So this story is an old story, focusing on the reality that we should return the borrowed things, especially money taken from our friends. So what is the theme of this story? Let's have a fleeting glance on it. The author's close friend Todd is going on a tour to Bermuda. Okay. Just before his departure, he wants some small change to pay off the taxi. He asks the writer to lend him $1. Stephen Leacock also gives it readily to him, as he was his friend. Todd departs for Bermuda. He writes a letter to the author from Bermuda, but there is no dollar inside the envelope. 12 months passed by. Todd has written from Bermuda, but has not bothered to return the $1 to the writer. The lender is too decent to offend his friend by demanding his dollar back, as he was shy in nature. He doesn't want to hurt his friend. He tries many ways to remind Todd about the dollar he owes, but the memory of the unpaid dollar refuses to enter in Todd's mind. The author feels miserable about the dollar that his friends owe him. He says that he will carry the recollection of the dollar, to his grave. So this is very serious. The lost dollar is the reminder of the borrowed amount to all those friends who have forgotten about it. So this is very ironic story. Let's turn toward the next story here in this series, entitled Necklace, written by Guy de Maupassant. What is the story about? Let's have a fleeting glance on the theme of the story in brief. Mrs. Loisel had lost the necklace that she had borrowed from her friend, and instead of confessing it to the owner, she got into more debts and poverty to repay the amount. This story tells us about the negative effect of pride and vanity, and emphasizes the importance of being contented with what one has in the life. So we should not be showy and dandy. Because, when we fall prey to the feeling of pride and vanity in the life, we have to lose something in the life. We become loser. So the moral of the story is we should be satisfied and contented what we have with us. It's a very simple message of the story, written by Guy de Maupassant, entitled The Necklace. Let us turn toward the next story here in this series. Crazy They Call Me, written by Zadie Smith, written in 2017, the recent story, written ever by the writer. Crazy They Call Me is a short story that originates itself around the story of Billie Holiday, a popular jazz and swing singer in 1930, projects an intense conveyance of misery one must undergo as a figure in the Hollywood industry. So, this is the sufferings, longings, troubles, problems, harassments, and sentiments of the Hollywood stars as well the Bollywoods also. So this is somewhat a different story. Let us turn towards the next story here in this series. And the story is about the snows of Kilimanjaro, written by the famous American writer Ernest Hemingway, and this story has been published in 1936. So let us study the story in brief. Harry, a writer, and his wife Helen are stranded while on safari in Africa. Okay, a bearing burnt out on their truck, and Harry is talking about the gangrene that has infected his leg when he did not apply iodine after he scratched it. As they wait for a rescue plane from Nairobi that he knows won't arrive on time, Harry spends his time drinking and insulting Helen. And he does this out of frustration. Harry reviews his life. This is flashback technique used by the short story writer, realizing that he wasted his talent through procrastination and luxury from a marriage to a wealthy woman that he doesn't love. I think that the theme of the story is quite clear to you. So, what is the moral of the story? The marriage, the futility out of matrimonial relationship is the theme of this novel, is the theme of the story. The snows of Kilimanjaro, the snows are quite cold. Sometimes while leading the married life, the relationship between the husband and the wife becomes also cold and detached. There are no sentiments, no feelings. And they lead the married life without love, without emotions. The same reality has been pinpointed and focused here in this story by Ernest Hemingway, that there should be intimacy, warm relationship should be there in married life is the beautiful theme of this story. Let us turn towards the next story here in this series, A Sound of Thunder, written by Ray Bradbury, which published in 1952. So the present story offers wealthy adventures, the chance to travel back in time to hunt extinct species such as dinosaurs. A hunter named Askels pays $10,000 to join a hunting party that will travel back 66 million years to the late Cretaceous period on a gilded safari to kill a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So this is somewhat different story, an exceptional story having its theme, A Sound of Thunder, focusing on the reality that man is behind extinction of the nature and the animal species. It is our moral duty to protect the nature and to nurture and to develop the animals. Let us turn toward the next story here in this series. The last story here in this presentation, entitled Orpheus and Eurydice, which published in 1762, written by Christoph Gluck. The most beautiful, lamentable love story ever written in English literature. Orpheus joined the expedition of the Argonauts, saving them from the music of the sirens by playing his own more powerful music. On his return, he married Eurydice, the most beautiful girl, who was soon killed by a snake bite. And Orpheus became very sad. Overcome with the feelings of the grief and disappointment in the heart, Orpheus ventured himself to the land of the dead in the attempt to bring Eurydice back to life. He sacrifices his life when his effort became useless. The king, the land of the dead, accepted his request to return Eurydice to him. But there was one condition, that he should not look back when he will travel in the direction of the earth. Orpheus accepted it and initiated his journey in the direction of the earth. When he was very close to the earth, he looked back to check whether Eurydice is following him or not. And at the same time, as you can visualize in the picture, a white figure appeared there just beside Orpheus, and Eurydice exclaimed in despair, "Oh, Orpheus, Orpheus, why did you look back? How dearly I love you, Orpheus. But as you have broken the promise given to the king, now I have to go back, Orpheus." And that figure melted away, disappeared, leaving Orpheus once again in distress, sad. Orpheus sat down here on this earth in the memory of Eurydice, taking no food and water. Without food and water, his body became extinct, and he also died one day and joined Eurydice there in the haven. This is the story about true love. So this is literature, my dear friends. Thank you very much for your patient listening and watching this presentation for today. Tomorrow we are going to study the MCQ, multiple choice questions asked on novels and short stories in NET and SET examination. So thank you very much for being with me always very positively. I request you to search all the stories in detail to make the content strong. Have a nice time. God bless you all. I stop my presentation. Thank you very much.